The morning of November 11th, 1943, Lieutenant Eugene Valencia squinted through the plexiglass canopy of his F6F Hellcat at 22,000 feet over Rabaul. Below him stretched an unbroken layer of cumulus clouds, thick as cotton batting, concealing everything beneath. His radar officer aboard the nearby destroyer had vectored his division toward an incoming Japanese strike, but Valencia couldn't see a thing. Standard doctrine was clear. Maintain altitude above cloud cover, wait for breaks in the weather. Never commit to a blind dive through clouds where you couldn't see what waited below. Then his radio crackled. His wingman had spotted the distinctive contrails of Japanese aircraft beneath the cloud layer, moving toward the American fleet at 12,000 feet. Valencia had perhaps 30 seconds to decide. He could circle above, waiting for better visibility while the enemy strike closed on vulnerable ships, or he could do something that training had explicitly warned against. He rolled his Hellcat onto its back and dove straight into the clouds. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The world went white. Valencia's visibility dropped to zero as moisture condensed across his canopy. He was flying at 320 miles per hour into a wall of vapor, descending at nearly 4,000 feet per minute, with no visual reference to the horizon, the ocean, or the enemy aircraft he knew were somewhere in this grey nothing. His instruments told him he was inverted and diving, but his inner ear insisted he was flying straight and level. Spatial disorientation killed pilots regularly. Cloud diving added another layer of danger. Collision with unseen terrain, or worse, collision with your own wingmen also diving blind. But Valencia had calculated something the Japanese pilots below hadn't anticipated. They were flying in formation beneath the clouds, confident that the weather provided them protection from American fighters above. They expected any attack to come from ahead or from the sides, where lookouts could spot approaching threats. They weren't looking straight up into the cloud layer they'd just passed through. And they certainly weren't expecting 4 Hellcats to come screaming out of those clouds at a 45-degree angle with guns blazing. Valencia broke through the cloud base at 14,000 feet. Below him, precisely where the radar officer had predicted, a formation of 9 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers flew in tight V formation with 6-0 escorts weaving above them. Valencia's dive had given him a 100-mile-per-hour speed advantage and perfect positioning. He was behind and above the entire formation. The Japanese pilots never saw him until his 650 caliber machine guns started tearing through the bomber formation. What happened in the next 40 seconds changed how American fighter pilots thought about weather, visibility, and the tactical use of clouds as weapons rather than obstacles. This wasn't the sanitized version of air combat that appeared in training films. This was instrumental flying pushed past safe limits, navigation by dead reckoning while inverted, and a willingness to trade temporary blindness for permanent surprise. The pilots who survived these cloud ambushes discovered that sometimes the most dangerous decision was the safest one. That weather could hide you from the enemy just as effectively as it hid the enemy from you, and that Japanese fighter tactics, refined through years of combat in clear skies over China, fell apart when American fighters started attacking from directions that shouldn't have been possible. The Grumman F6F Hellcat entered combat service in August 1943, designed specifically to address every weakness American pilots had identified while fighting Zeros for the previous 20 months. Where the earlier F4F Wildcat was underpowered and sluggish, the Hellcat mounted a 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R 2,800 radial engine. Where the Wildcat struggled above 15,000 feet, the Hellcat maintained excellent performance, up to 25,000 feet. Where the Wildcat's climb rate left pilots vulnerable during engagement, the Hellcat could climb at 3,200 feet per minute, fast enough to regain altitude advantage quickly. But raw performance numbers told only part of the story. The Hellcat's design philosophy reflected hard lessons learned from 2 years of Pacific combat. It couldn't outturn a Zero in a horizontal dogfight. No American fighter could. But it didn't need to. By late 1943, American tactical doctrine had completely abandoned the idea of turning combat against Japanese fighters. Instead, Hellcat pilots employed energy tactics, maintaining altitude advantage, making high-speed slashing attacks, and using superior diving speed to disengage before Japanese fighters could respond. The Hellcat excelled at this style of combat. Its robust construction meant it could dive at speeds approaching 450 miles per hour without structural failure. Its heavy armament, 6 50 caliber Browning machine guns with 400 rounds per gun, meant that even a 1-second burst delivered devastating firepower. Its armor, protection, and self-sealing fuel tanks meant that pilots who took hits could often make it back to their carriers. The aircraft was designed for pilots who understood they were flying a platform for 6 machine guns, not an aircraft optimized for aerobatic maneuvering. By November 1943, Hellcat squadrons were spreading across the Pacific Theater. Navy pilots flying from carriers like USS Essex, USS Lexington, and USS Enterprise received the new fighters with something approaching reverence. After months of nursing worn-out Wildcats through combat, the find of the Prues, Hellcat felt like transitioning from a pickup truck to a muscle car. Everything was better, faster, stronger, more responsive. But new pilots quickly learned that the Hellcat's capabilities came with new tactical possibilities and new risks. The Southwest Pacific in late 1943 presented weather conditions that complicated every aspect of air combat. Towering cumulus clouds built up daily over the tropical islands, creating columns of vapor that reached 30,000 feet or higher. Squall lines moved unpredictably across the ocean, reducing visibility to zero within minutes. Morning missions often launched in clear weather, only to find targets obscured by afternoon cloud buildup. Pilots, trained in clear California or Florida skies, found themselves operating in an environment where visual references disappeared without warning. Traditional fighter doctrine treated clouds as obstacles to be avoided. The risk of spatial disorientation was too high. Instrument flying, skills taught during training, focused on emergency situations, getting safely back to base when weather closed in, not aggressive combat maneuvering in zero visibility. Flight instructors specifically warned against aerobatics in clouds. The inner ear couldn't be trusted without visual references. Pilots who ignored this guidance often entered spirals they perceived as level flight, overstressed their aircraft trying to correct what they thought was climbing or turning, and crashed without ever understanding what went wrong. Japanese pilots operated under similar constraints. Zero pilots were trained for visual combat in good weather conditions. Their aircraft lacked sophisticated instrument panels. The Zero's design philosophy emphasized simplicity and lightweight, which meant minimal instrumentation compared to American fighters. Japanese pilots learned to use clouds defensively, ducking into weather when pursued, but they treated clouds as hiding places, not tactical weapons. This created an asymmetry American pilots would eventually exploit. Hellcat instrument panels included a full suite of gyroscopic instruments: artificial horizon, directional gyro, turn and bank indicator, sensitive altimeter. These instruments allowed skilled pilots to maintain controlled flight in clouds, though it required concentration and trust that contradicted every instinct. Japanese fighters had basic instruments but lacked the redundancy and precision of American panel layouts. More importantly, Japanese training emphasized visual flight skills over instrument proficiency. The first documented case of a deliberate cloud ambush occurred on September 27, 1943, though not involving Hellcats. Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare, already famous as the Navy's first Ace and Medal of Honor recipient, was leading a night fighter experiment using F6F Hellcats equipped with primitive radar sets. During a twilight patrol near the Gilbert Islands, O'Hare tracked a formation of Japanese bombers using his radar operator's guidance. The bombers were flying through a patch of cumulus clouds, invisible to visual contact. O'Hare realized something. His radar could see through weather. The Japanese bombers, relying on visual lookouts, could not see through clouds. He maneuvered his section to intercept the bomber formation inside the cloud bank itself, emerging within 200 feet of the enemy bombers. The Japanese crews never saw O'Hare's Hellcats until gunfire started shredding their aircraft. O'Hare shot down 2 bombers before the formation broke apart in panic, scattering in all directions. Some crashed into the ocean while trying to escape. Others collided with each other in the confusion. The tactical lesson was profound but not immediately recognized. O'Hare's radar-guided attack seemed like a specialized night-fighting technique, not applicable to standard daylight operations. The after-action report focused on the radar technology, not the principle that clouds could provide concealment for the attacker rather than just the defender. O'Hare himself was killed in action less than 2 months later during a confused night engagement, so he never had opportunity to develop the tactic further or teach it systematically to other pilots. The breakthrough came from radar controllers aboard destroyers and cruisers equipped with increasingly sophisticated air search radar systems. By October 1943, these radar operators could track formations of aircraft at ranges exceeding 50 miles. They could see through weather that rendered pilots completely blind. More importantly, they could vector fighters onto intercept courses with precision that didn't require visual contact until the final moments. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alex Vraciu, flying from USS Independence, first used radar vectors for a cloud ambush on October 5, 1943, during operations near Wake Island. The radar officer aboard a nearby cruiser identified a Japanese strike group approaching at 15,000 feet, hidden beneath a solid cloud deck. The radar controller calculated that the enemy formation was flying straight and level, maintaining constant altitude and heading. They weren't maneuvering evasively because they believed the weather protected them. The controller vectored Vraciu's division to a position 10 miles ahead of the Japanese formation and 2,000 feet above the cloud layer. Then came the critical instruction: roll inverted at a specific time, dive through the clouds at a specific heading, and level out at 13,000 feet. If the radar calculations were accurate, Vraciu would emerge from the clouds directly behind the Japanese formation. If the calculations were wrong, he'd be diving blind through weather with no enemy to attack and his division scattered across miles of sky. Vraciu trusted the radar operator. He rolled inverted at the designated moment and pulled his Hellcat into a steep dive directly into the clouds. The sensation was disorienting even for experienced pilots. The grey-white of cloud interior provided no visual reference. His compass spun as he maintained the assigned heading. His altimeter unwound rapidly as he descended at nearly 5,000 feet per minute. He counted seconds in his head, estimating when he should level out. Too early, and he'd still be in clouds when he leveled. Too late, and he might overshoot past the enemy formation. He broke out of the clouds at exactly 13,200 feet, 300 yards directly ahead of him, flying in perfect formation. A group of 7 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers, escorted by 4 Zeros, cruised toward their target. They were completely unaware that 4 Hellcats had just materialized behind them from the clouds above. Vraciu opened fire before the Japanese pilots registered his presence. His first burst set a Val's fuel tank ablaze. His second burst shredded another Val's wing. His wingmen destroyed 2 more bombers in the opening seconds. The Zero escorts reacted, but their response was confused and uncoordinated. They'd been watching ahead and to the sides, expecting any threat to come from the direction of the American fleet they were approaching. Hellcats attacking from behind and above, emerging from weather the Zeros had already passed through, violated their tactical expectations. By the time the Zero pilots oriented themselves to this unexpected threat, 2 of their 4 fighters were already smoking and falling. The remaining 2 Zeros fled into the cloud layer, using weather defensively as they'd been trained. Vraciu's division shot down 6 bombers and 2 fighters in less than 90 seconds without losing a single Hellcat. The after-action debriefing focused on the radar vectoring accuracy and the complete surprise achieved by attacking through clouds. Within days, every fighter director officer in the task force had reviewed the engagement report. The tactical implications were obvious. Radar could guide fighters to cloud ambush positions with precision that made this repeatable rather than lucky. The technique spread through word of mouth before any official doctrine incorporated it. Carrier fighter squadrons in Task Force 58 began practicing the maneuver during training flights. Pilots would fly formation above clouds, while radar operators aboard ship guided them through simulated intercepts, calling headings and dive points. The practice revealed how difficult blind diving actually was. Pilots had to trust their instruments completely while overriding their inner ear's insistence that they were in uncontrolled flight. Several training accidents occurred when pilots lost spatial awareness during cloud dives. One Hellcat pilot became disoriented after entering clouds inverted, failed to level his wings during the dive, and crashed into the ocean in a spiral he never recognized. Another pilot, attempting to dive too steeply, exceeded his aircraft's maximum speed and experienced control surface flutter that nearly tore his elevators off before he recovered below the clouds. These accidents established safety parameters. Dive angle couldn't exceed 45 degrees. Airspeed during cloud penetration couldn't exceed 350 miles per hour. Minimum cloud base altitude for recovery had to be at least 8,000 feet to allow margin for error. Fighter directors developed standardized radio call procedures for cloud ambush attacks. They'd identify the target formation, calculate its heading and altitude, position the attacking fighters above and ahead of the target track, then issue specific commands. Stand by for attack run. Roll inverted on my mark. Mark. Maintain heading 0, 9-0. Descend to Angels 13. Target should be 12 o'clock, 3 miles. When you break out. The precision required split-second timing and absolute trust between pilot and radar operator. By December 1943, cloud ambush tactics had become standard procedure for Hellcat squadrons operating in the Central Pacific. The tactic proved particularly effective during the Gilbert Islands campaign. Japanese air attacks on the invasion fleet approached from bases in the Marshall Islands, often staging through intermediate islands. The flight routes were predictable. The weather over the Gilberts in November was consistently cloudy. American radar tracked every incoming raid from 100 miles out. Lieutenant Commander Edward Outlaw, leading VF6 from USS Intrepid, executed 7 successful cloud ambushes during the Tarawa operation between November 20th and 24th, 1943. His squadron shot down 41 Japanese aircraft during that period, while losing only 2 Hellcats to combat. Outlaw's tactics were methodical. His division would patrol at altitude above cloud layers, guided by radar vectors toward incoming raids. When positioned correctly, they'd dive through weather and emerge in perfect attack position before Japanese pilots realized they were under attack. The psychological impact on Japanese aircrews was significant. Intercepted radio transmissions and prisoner interrogations revealed growing fear of American fighters that appeared without warning from clouds. Some Japanese bomber crews reported that American fighters seemed to materialize from solid weather, suggesting near-magical abilities. This wasn't superstition. It was the logical conclusion when your formation flew through empty sky one moment and was under devastating attack the next, with no warning from lookouts and no radar of your own to provide advanced detection. Japanese tactical adjustments came slowly. Some commanders ordered formations to fly above cloud layers rather than beneath them, accepting reduced bombing accuracy to avoid cloud ambushes. This forced Japanese aircraft higher, where Hellcats had performance advantages and where thin air reduced zero maneuverability. Other Japanese units attempted to fly through clouds rather than under them, hoping concealment worked both ways. This scattered formations and led to several incidents where Japanese aircraft collided with each other in zero visibility. The fundamental problem facing Japanese aviation was lack of radar technology comparable to American systems. Japanese ships and aircraft had primitive radar sets by late 1943, but nothing approaching the sophistication of American air search radars and fighter direction systems. Japanese pilots couldn't execute radar-guided intercepts because they didn't have radar operators providing vectors. They couldn't safely navigate through clouds in formation because their instrument panels and training didn't support that capability. American pilots, meanwhile, were becoming increasingly proficient at cloud combat. The Hellcats' instrument panel layout made blind flying manageable for trained pilots. The gyroscopic artificial horizon showed aircraft attitude even when visual references disappeared. The directional gyro maintained heading accuracy. The radio altimeter provided precise altitude readings. Pilots learned to scan these instruments in sequence: attitude, heading, altitude, airspeed, rate of climb. The scan became automatic through practice, allowing pilots to maintain controlled flight through clouds, while still processing tactical radio calls from radar controllers. The technique required overcoming powerful psychological barriers. Every human instinct screamed that flying blind at high speed toward an invisible enemy was suicidal. The first time felt like jumping off a cliff. The second time felt slightly less terrifying. By the fifth or sixth cloud dive, it became almost routine, though never comfortable. Pilots learned to recognize the physical sensations of disorientation and trust instruments over feelings. Some pilots tensed their stomach, muscles during dives, fighting the sensation of falling that triggered panic responses. Others found that talking themselves through the instrument scan, verbalizing altitude and heading callouts, helped maintain focus through the disorientation. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The integration of cloud ambush tactics into standard operating procedure represented a broader transformation in how American naval aviation approached air combat. By early 1944, fighter pilots no longer treated weather as merely an environmental factor to work around. Weather became a tactical element to exploit. Clouds provided concealment that radar could penetrate, but visual lookouts could not. This asymmetry, combined with superior American instrumentation and training, created opportunities that Japanese pilots couldn't match. Commander David McCampbell, who would become the Navy's top ace with 34 victories, refined cloud ambush tactics during the Marshall Islands campaign in January and February 1944. McCampbell commanded Air Group 15 aboard USS Essex, and he systematically trained his fighter pilots in instrument flying and radar-directed intercepts. His approach was methodical. Every pilot in his squadron practiced cloud penetrations until they could maintain formation integrity through weather. He established standard procedures for rejoining after cloud attacks, recognizing that formations often scattered when diving through zero visibility. McCampbell's innovation was using clouds not just for surprise attacks, but for disengagement and reset. When his Hellcats encountered superior numbers of Japanese fighters, he'd lead his formation into nearby cloud banks, use the weather to break contact, then emerge at a different altitude and position for renewed attacks. The Japanese Zero pilots, trained for visual combat, found this profoundly disorienting. They'd be engaged in a dogfight, then American fighters would vanish into clouds. Minutes later, Hellcats would appear from a different direction, often with altitude and speed advantages that made counterattack impossible. The Battle of Truk Lagoon on February 17th and 18th, 1944, showcased how thoroughly cloud tactics had evolved. Truk was Japan's major forward base in the Central Pacific, heavily defended by land-based fighters and bombers. American carrier task forces launched massive strikes against the base, and Japanese defenders scrambled hundreds of fighters to intercept. Weather conditions over Truk were mixed. Scattered cumulus clouds between 5,000 and 15,000 feet, with heavier build-ups to the north and east. Lieutenant Alexander Vrasiu, now one of the Navy's leading aces, led a division of Hellcats during a strike on Truk's airfields on February 17th. Inbound to the target, his division encountered a formation of approximately 30 Japanese fighters climbing to intercept American bombers at higher altitude. Vrasiu was outnumbered 7-1. Standard doctrine would suggest avoiding engagement or calling for reinforcements. Instead, Vrasiu identified a large cumulus buildup northwest of the Japanese formation. He maneuvered his division toward the clouds while maintaining altitude advantage. The Japanese fighters turned to intercept, climbing aggressively. Vrasiu waited until the Zeros committed to their climb, bleeding off speed in their attempt to reach the Hellcats' altitude. Then he rolled inverted and dove into the cloud bank. His wingmen followed in sequence, disappearing into the weather within seconds. The Japanese pilots saw 4 Hellcats vanish and assumed they'd fled toward the American fleet. Inside the clouds, Vrasiu executed a calculated maneuver. He maintained his dive for only 15 seconds, leveling out still within the weather at 12,000 feet. He turned 90 degrees left and flew through clouds for another 20 seconds. then broke out into clear air east of his original position. The Japanese formation was now 2 miles away, climbing through thin air toward where they expected to find fleeing Hellcats. They were looking in the wrong direction, climbing away from Vrasiu's actual position, presenting their vulnerable undersides. Vrasiu's division had traded their altitude advantage for positional advantage plus surprise. The Hellcats accelerated to attack speed and covered the 2-mile distance in less than 30 seconds. The Japanese pilots never saw the attack coming. Vrasiu's first burst destroyed a Zero that exploded so violently the pilot had no chance to bail out. His second attack set another Zero ablaze. His wingmen destroyed 3 more in the opening pass. The surviving Japanese pilots scattered, abandoning their intercept mission and diving for safety. Vrasiu's division had turned a 7-1 disadvantage into a devastating ambush through nothing more sophisticated than clouds, timing, and understanding how visual limitations affected enemy decision-making. The after-action report noted that cloud maneuvering allowed outnumbered fighters to reset engagements on favorable terms. Within weeks, this tactic had spread throughout the carrier task forces. Clouds weren't just concealment for attack. They were sanctuary for defense and repositioning tools that only worked for the side with superior instrument flying skills. Japanese pilots attempted to develop counters to American cloud tactics, but they faced insurmountable obstacles. The primary problem was instrumentation. Zero cockpits contained basic flight instruments: airspeed indicator, altimeter, compass, and a simple turn indicator. But they lacked the gyroscopic artificial horizon and directional gyro that made blind formation flying possible in American fighters. A Zero pilot entering clouds had to fly by needle, ball, and airspeed, a technique that required intense concentration and provided no information about his wingmen's positions. Japanese training programs didn't emphasize instrument flying to the same degree as American programs. Japanese doctrine, developed through years of combat over China, focused on visual combat skills, aerobatics, and marksmanship. These skills proved decisive in clear weather against poorly trained Chinese pilots flying obsolete aircraft. But they provided no advantage when American fighters attacked from clouds or used weather to break contact. Japanese replacement pilot training in 1944, already abbreviated due to fuel shortages and time constraints, couldn't incorporate extensive instrument flying instruction even if commanders recognized its importance. The second problem was radar. Japanese ships and island bases had radar sets by 1944, but the technology lagged years behind American systems in range, accuracy, and reliability. Japanese radar couldn't guide fighters through clouds to intercept positions. Fighter direction was primitive, usually limited to general warnings about incoming raids rather than precise vectors. Japanese pilots defending against American strikes often knew attacks were coming, but couldn't position themselves advantageously until they achieved visual contact, by which time well-executed attacks were already underway. Combat over the Marianas in June 1944 demonstrated how completely cloud tactics had tilted the tactical balance toward American forces. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, saw American carrier fighters destroy approximately 400 Japanese aircraft over 2 days. Weather played a significant role. Scattered clouds at multiple altitudes gave American pilots numerous opportunities for cloud ambushes, while Japanese formations flying toward American task forces were repeatedly bounced by Hellcats. Emerging from weather, Lieutenant Junior Grade George Duncan, flying from USS Yorktown, described a typical engagement on June 19th. His division was vectored by radar toward a large Japanese strike approaching from the west. Cloud cover was heavy between 10,000 and 18,000 feet. The radar controller positioned Duncan's division 5 miles ahead of the Japanese formation and 3,000 feet above the clouds. At the designated moment, Duncan rolled inverted and dove through the weather. He broke out of clouds at 16,000 feet with his division still in formation. Directly below them, approximately 40 Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes flew in loose formation, with perhaps 20 Zero escorts weaving above and around the strike group. Duncan's Hellcats had entered clouds as 4 separate aircraft and emerged as a coordinated attack element, positioned perfectly to devastate the enemy formation. The surprise was absolute. Duncan's opening pass destroyed 2 dive bombers before their gunners could react. His wingmen tore through the formation, scattering bombers and forcing 0 escorts to break off their protective coverage. The engagement lasted 7 minutes. Duncan's division shot down 9 Japanese aircraft, confirmed with 3 probables. Not a single Hellcat was damaged. The Japanese strike, already depleted by other intercepts, never reached the American fleet. Most surviving aircraft jettisoned their bombs and torpedoes to gain speed for escape. The cloud ambush hadn't just destroyed enemy aircraft, it had broken the cohesion of an entire strike package, rendering it combat ineffective. Multiply this scenario across hundreds of engagements during the Philippine Sea Battle, and the result was the catastrophic Japanese losses that ended their carrier aviation as an effective fighting force. American pilots weren't just better trained or flying better aircraft, though both factors mattered. They were fighting a fundamentally different style of air combat, one that integrated radar direction, instrument flying, and tactical use of weather into a system Japanese aviation couldn't match. The human cost of cloud fighting appeared in forms that never made official casualty reports. Pilots who regularly dove through clouds at high speed developed chronic sinus problems from rapid pressure changes. Some experienced persistent vertigo, even when flying in clear weather, their balance systems damaged by repeated disorientation. Flight surgeons documented cases of pilots who'd survived multiple cloud combat missions but developed anxiety responses when entering weather, their bodies remembering the stress even when their conscious minds suppressed fear. Lieutenant Thomas Harris, a Hellcat pilot with VF2 aboard USS Hornet, described the physical sensation of cloud diving in a letter home in March 1944. The moment you roll inverted and point your nose down into grey nothing, your stomach drops and your inner ear tells you you're falling out of control. Every instrument on your panel is reading numbers that contradict what your body feels. You're descending at 4,000 feet per minute, but your body insists you're straight and level. The instruments say you're inverted, but you feel right side up. You have to ignore every physical sensation and trust 3 gyroscopes spinning in your instrument panel, because if you trust your body, you'll spiral into the ocean and never understand what killed you. Harris survived the war with 19 victories, but he never flew again after returning home. The psychological toll of blind flying through combat conditions left him unable to enter clouds without panic attacks. He wasn't alone. Flight surgeons estimated that roughly 15% of pilots who routinely employed cloud ambush tactics developed some form of lasting anxiety response to instrument conditions. The Navy didn't classify this as combat fatigue or operational exhaustion because it didn't impair mission performance during the war, but it extracted a cost nonetheless. The tactical evolution of cloud fighting continued through late 1944 and into 1945 as the war moved closer to Japan's home islands. Weather over the Western Pacific during typhoon season created even more challenging conditions. Towering thunderstorms, turbulence that could tear aircraft apart, and icing conditions that could kill engines or make control surfaces inoperative. Hellcat pilots learned which clouds they could safely penetrate and which ones were death traps. Cumulus clouds with well-defined edges and relatively flat bases were safe for high-speed penetration. Cumulonimbus thunderheads with anvil tops and dark bases contained turbulence severe enough to break aircraft structures. Stratus layers, the flat grey clouds that covered entire regions, could be penetrated but offered no tactical advantage because they were too thin to provide. Concealment. Pilots developed visual judgment that let them assess cloud safety from miles away, reading weather the way infantrymen read terrain. The sophistication of American fighter direction reached its peak during operations off Okinawa in spring and summer 1945. Radar picket destroyers positioned between the invasion fleet and Japanese airfields provided advanced warning of kamikaze strikes. Fighter director officers aboard these ships controlled dozens of Hellcat divisions simultaneously, vectoring them onto intercept courses, guiding them through clouds to ambush positions, and coordinating attacks so that multiple divisions hit the same enemy formation from different directions within seconds. The kamikaze threat added urgency to cloud ambush tactics. Conventional Japanese formations could be scattered and discouraged through aggressive attack. Kamikaze pilots, committed to suicide attacks, couldn't be deterred. They had to be destroyed before reaching the fleet. Cloud ambushes became the primary defensive tactic because they allowed Hellcats to achieve total surprise against formations that wouldn't break off regardless of losses. Lieutenant Junior Grade Eugene Valencia, the same pilot who'd pioneered cloud diving over Rabaul in November 1943, perfected what became known as the Valencia Wheel during Okinawa operations. Valencia would position his division of 4 Hellcats around a clock face relative to an approaching kamikaze formation, with each Hellcat at a different altitude and using clouds for concealment. On his signal, all 4 Hellcats would attack simultaneously from different directions, creating a crossfire that maximized kills while minimizing the time kamikazes had to react. The setup required precise radar vectors and absolute trust between Valencia and his fighter director. The 4 Hellcats couldn't see each other once positioned in clouds at different altitudes. They relied entirely on radio commands and timing. But when executed properly, the Valencia Wheel was devastatingly effective. Valencia's division shot down over 50 Japanese aircraft during the Okinawa campaign, with most kills occurring during the first seconds of engagement when kamikazes were still in formation and hadn't dispersed. The tactical principles developed by Hellcat pilots diving through clouds influenced American air combat doctrine for decades after World War II ended. The Korean War saw American pilots employing similar tactics against MiG-15 seconds. Navy F-9F Panther and Air Force F-86 Sabre pilots used clouds for concealment and surprise attacks, though jet speeds made the maneuvers even more challenging. Vietnam-era fighter pilots rediscovered cloud ambush tactics when engaging North Vietnamese MiGs over mountainous terrain, where weather could conceal attackers until the final seconds before engagement. Modern fighter combat training at Top Gun and other advanced schools includes extensive instruction in all-weather tactics. Contemporary pilots learn to use clouds, terrain masking, and radar limitations to achieve surprise against adversaries. The technology has changed dramatically. Today's fighters have radar systems that can track targets through weather, helmet-mounted displays that maintain situational awareness in clouds, and GPS navigation that makes blind flying through zero visibility relatively straightforward. But the underlying principles remain identical to what Eugene Valencia and Alex Vrasiu figured out over the Pacific in 1943 and 1944. The human element hasn't changed either. Modern fighter pilots still experience disorientation when flying through clouds at high speed. They still must override their inner ear's insistence that instruments are lying about aircraft attitude. They still feel the stomach-dropping sensation when rolling inverted into weather. Advanced technology makes the maneuvers safer and more precise, but it doesn't eliminate the psychological challenge of deliberately flying blind toward an enemy who might not be where you expect when you break out of clouds. The Hellcat itself became obsolete within years after World War II ended. Jet fighters replaced propeller-driven aircraft throughout American naval aviation by the early 1950s. But the tactical DNA of Hellcat pilots influenced how the Navy approached fighter operations for generations. The emphasis on radar integration, all-weather capability, and using environmental factors as tactical weapons rather than obstacles became embedded in naval aviation culture. Eugene Valencia retired from the Navy as a captain in 1964 after a distinguished career that included combat missions in Korea. He spent his later years teaching tactics to younger pilots, always emphasizing the importance of surprise and using whatever advantages technology or environment provided. He'd describe rolling inverted into clouds over Rabaul in November 1943. That moment when the world went white and his instruments contradicted every physical sensation, and how breaking through the cloud base to find Japanese bombers directly below him taught him that impossible-seeming tactics often worked better than comfortable ones. Alex Vrasiu survived the war as the Navy's fourth-ranking ace with 19 victories. He'd pioneered multiple cloud ambush techniques, survived being shot down over the Philippines, and eventually returned to combat operations. In post-war interviews, Vrasiu emphasized that cloud diving wasn't about bravery or daring, it was about mathematics and physics. If you understood aircraft performance, instrument flying, and enemy tactical patterns, Cloud ambushes were lower risk than many conventional engagements because surprise eliminated most of the enemy's ability to fight back. David McCampbell, the Navy's top ace, received the Medal of Honor for an engagement on October 24, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. He and his wingman intercepted a Japanese strike of over 60 aircraft, shooting down 15 between them while protecting American ships below. The citation didn't mention that McCampbell used clouds to break contact twice during the engagement, diving into weather to reset his position and altitude when Japanese escorts threatened to overwhelm him through sheer numbers. The tactic that saved his life wasn't considered remarkable enough to include in official accounts. The Japanese pilots who faced Hellcats emerging from clouds left few records of their perspective. Most were killed during the war. The survivors who were interviewed decades later described a growing sense of helplessness as American tactical sophistication overwhelmed Japanese capabilities. One former Zero pilot, interviewed in the 1980s, recalled that by mid-1944, Japanese fighter pilots knew they couldn't match American fighters in vertical combat, couldn't compete in diving attacks, couldn't maintain formation through clouds, and couldn't avoid radar-directed intercepts. The only advantage Zeros retained, superior turning ability at low speeds, became irrelevant because American pilots refused to fight turning engagements. This psychological dimension mattered as much as the physical tactics. Japanese naval aviation in 1942 had been confident, aggressive, and tactically sophisticated. By 1944, that confidence had evaporated. Pilots flew combat missions knowing they were outmatched in training, equipment, and tactical doctrine. Some adapted and survived. Most didn't. The organizational learning that allowed American pilots to develop and spread cloud ambush tactics within months had no equivalent in Japanese aviation. Successful techniques remained isolated to individual units. Broader dissemination was prevented by communication problems, bureaucratic rigidity, and the simple fact that experienced pilots were dying faster than they could train replacements. The broader lesson of cloud ambush tactics extended beyond aerial combat. American forces across all services demonstrated similar adaptive capacity throughout the war. When faced with German tactical innovations, American commanders studied, analyzed, and developed counters within weeks or months. When American tactics proved ineffective, they were discarded and replaced rapidly. This institutional agility came partly from American industrial capacity that allowed experimentation without crippling resource constraints. But it also reflected cultural factors: willingness to question authority, meritocratic systems that rewarded results over seniority, and communication networks that spread successful innovations organically through informal channels before official doctrine caught up. Hellcat pilots diving through clouds weren't following official procedures. They were improvising based on available technology, understanding enemy limitations, and willingness to try uncomfortable tactics when comfortable ones weren't working. Their squadron commanders didn't stop them because the results proved the tactics' effectiveness. Higher headquarters eventually incorporated cloud ambush procedures into official doctrine, but only after pilots had already proven the techniques through hundreds of successful engagements. This pattern repeated throughout American military history. The most effective tactics often emerged from battlefield innovation rather than planning staff recommendations. Official doctrine codified what worked rather than prescribing what should work. This approach only functioned because the American military system allowed and even encouraged subordinates to experiment, rewarded success regardless of whether methods matched approved procedures, and maintained communication channels that let successful innovations spread rapidly. The statistical impact of cloud ambush tactics on Pacific air combat is difficult to isolate from other factors that influenced American success. Hellcat pilots achieved overall kill ratios exceeding 19-1 by war's end. How much of that came from cloud tactics versus superior aircraft performance, better training, or declining Japanese pilot quality can't be precisely determined. But combat reports from late 1943 through 1945 show that engagements involving surprise attacks from clouds had extraordinarily lopsided outcomes, often approaching 30 or 40-1 in favor of American pilots. The technique also saved countless American lives by disrupting Japanese strikes before they reached vulnerable ships or ground forces. Kamikaze attacks that were intercepted early and scattered through cloud ambushes inflicted far less damage than those that penetrated close to their targets. Conventional bomber formations hit by surprise. Attacks often jettisoned ordnance and fled, aborting missions entirely. The deterrent effect was measurable. Japanese commanders increasingly struggled to maintain aircrew morale as losses mounted and success rates plummeted. By August 1945, when the war ended, American carrier aviation had achieved total air superiority over the Western Pacific. Hellcat and Corsair pilots could operate almost without opposition. The Japanese had lost not just aircraft and pilots, but the institutional knowledge and capability to contest American air operations. Cloud ambush tactics represented one thread in this larger tapestry of American tactical dominance, but an important thread. The willingness to fly blind through weather, trusting instruments and radar controllers, exemplified the broader American approach. Use every advantage technology provides, exploit every enemy limitation, and never fight the way the opponent expects or prefers. The Hellcat pilots who pioneered cloud diving didn't think of themselves as revolutionaries or innovators. They were solving immediate tactical problems with available tools, but their solutions changed how fighter pilots thought about weather, instruments, and the relationship between human skill and technological capability. The cockpit instrument panel transformed from emergency backup into primary combat tool. Clouds shifted from obstacles to weapons. Radar evolved from warning system into tactical guidance network. These conceptual transformations mattered more than any individual engagement. They represented a fundamental shift in how aerial warfare was conducted, moving from visual combat between individual pilots to integrated operations, where technology, training, and tactical sophistication combined into systems that overwhelmed opponents who couldn't match all three elements simultaneously. Japanese aviation could produce capable pilots and decent aircraft, but without comparable radar technology and instrument flying emphasis, they couldn't compete against the systematic integration American naval aviation achieved. The legacy of those Hellcat pilots rolling inverted into clouds over the Pacific extends into modern warfare in ways they never imagined. Every time a contemporary fighter pilot uses weather or terrain to mask his approach until the final seconds before engagement, he's applying principles developed over Rabaul and Truk. Every time a radar controller guides fighters onto intercept courses through zero visibility conditions, she's following procedures refined during the Philippine Sea and Okinawa. Every time a pilot trusts his instruments while his inner ear insists he's in a fatal spiral, he's validating the lesson Eugene Valencia learned in November 1943. Sometimes the most dangerous decision is the safest one. The clouds over the Pacific in World War II hid many things. Japanese formations seeking protection from American fighters, American ships concealing themselves from enemy reconnaissance, weather systems that turned the ocean surface into chaos. But those clouds also revealed something about human adaptability and tactical evolution. The side that could see through weather, navigate through zero visibility, and use environmental factors as weapons rather than merely enduring them, held an advantage that skill alone couldn't overcome. The Zero pilots who flew beneath those clouds in late 1943 and through 1944 never knew if the next second would bring Hellcats screaming down from above. The mathematical superiority their aircraft had possessed in 1942 meant nothing against enemies who refused to fight in the horizontal plane, who attacked from clouds without warning, and who could reset any engagement through instrument flying that Zeros couldn't match. Japanese tactical doctrine, developed through years of combat success, had been invalidated by American innovation in less than 18 months. The lesson wasn't that clouds were magic or that instrument flying guaranteed victory. The lesson was that tactical advantage came from understanding the complete combat system, aircraft capabilities, pilot skills, supporting technology, enemy limitations, and environmental factors, then integrating all elements into an approach that exploited asymmetries opponents couldn't counter. Hellcat pilots diving through clouds exemplified this systems-level thinking. They weren't just brave aviators making daring attacks. They were components in an integrated combat system that used radar guidance, instrument flying skills, aircraft performance characteristics, and enemy tactical rigidity to achieve outcomes that seemed impossible based on pure aircraft versus aircraft comparison. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.